will be a relatively light agenda, but I guess let's see. Last week's recording is up on YouTube, as with all the previous weeks, and tonight's will go up there as well. I haven't seen progress in a lot of the ongoing work. I don't know if anyone from this group has engaged in any of the container stuff, but I think that is stalled out. And I know that the tool chain thing is waiting on me to email Lemming. But I don't know, I was going to check there, Mike, if you have found any support within Intel for any of the tool chains.
I'm behind on that AR. So, I mean, temporarily you can just put my name down as supporting the 2015, 2017, 2019.
Okay. So I was hopefully going to spend a few hours this evening kind of doing some of these tasks. So that will include kind of I don't know about a nag mail, but a mail going out that says we plan to cut support for Clang and GCC unless someone comes forward with support. And that's mostly just a shot across the bow to indicate that we really need someone to come forward with support.
Okay. So I'm hoping Lemming will accept the Clang one, or there may be one of the other developers that worked on the Clang support. I'll step up there. GCC, is it all that you haven't gotten response for any architectures on GCC?
That is correct.
Okay. All right.
Let's see. I think well, I don't know if I have any other recap. Has there been any progress on anything else that anyone wants to talk about?
I can give some status on the using PRs for code review.
Okay, yeah.
Where we were last time was that from a doing the action correctly with the maximum security profile, needed to move it into a actual GitHub action. I successfully did that for the assigned reviewers. And in addition, I actually got the caching to work as well for the Python environment. So the time to run the assign reviewers and assign the author as the assignee is about between 1 to 2 seconds for it to actually set up the environment and run the action to do the work. The piece that takes the longest, depending upon the size of the target repository, is fetching the target repository. And for the EDK2 repo, that averages between 6 and 7 seconds. So we're down to less than 10 seconds is typical for being able to assign the reviewers once there is either a PR is opened, reopened, synchronized, or converted from a draft to a ready for review. So and that pattern, it took me a while because I'm implementing this action in Python, and that requires doing in GitHub nomenclature what's called a composite action. And there are some oddities about that style of action relative to a Docker or a Node.js styled container for running your action. So I had a little bit of learning there to get all that figured out, but I do have that working. And the other thing that I was able to integrate in was the corner case where one of the developers involved in the pull request decides to manually add some extra reviewers. And so the first version of the action was looking at the reviewer's file and the code owner's file, and what if files were added or removed to the scope of the PR, it would update the set of reviewers to match the exact set of files. And that meant that if you, for example, remove some files, it may remove some reviewers. But there was somebody had asked the question of what happens if I manually add some reviewers, because I want somebody else to look at this one as well beyond what the reviewers file says or the code owner's file says. And so I'm able to detect that condition as well. And if a reviewer is manually added by somebody other than the GitHub action bot, then it won't remove it unless that reviewer is manually removed by a non-bot user. So that corner case was covered as well in the implementation of the action. This is today sitting in a repository. The implementation of this action is sitting in a repository in my GitHub area, and I'm able to point at that from the Tiano Core EDK2 code review repo as a way to go run the action, and that works. But the real landing zone for that repository that contains that action will be in Tiano Core. I just put it in my personal one until I got it up and stable, and then I'll put the first version over in Tiano Core, and we'll tag it with a release. So that is at least so far, one action that's going to be of type pull request target, which actually from a fork gives for running a pull request from a forked area, gives them some extra permissions on the target repository. And I've limited that as much as possible to only granting write permissions to the PR. They do not get write permissions to the repository or the users or any of the other scopes of content from GitHub. So the most that could happen if there was a issue would be the scope of the PR itself. But even then, the way that it's now isolated into its own action implementation, and that all the input is being verified before used, I think it meets the criteria that GitHub describes for being a well implemented action with no security issues.
Sounds great.
The other piece that I've been working on is when I was evaluating code owners and the reviewers file and trying to map it from our existing maintainers.txt file, I found a number of issues in both our repository and in maintainers.txt. Those changes and updates have been going through Bugzilla, and then the changes in code review and updates. There is one remaining item, which is there were 2 GitHub IDs that were missing, and I'm just waiting for the review by on that before it gets updated. And I think then maintainers.txt and our current EDK2 trunk is in good state for mapping to code owners and reviewers. And the second GitHub action that I'm working on right now is if there's a request to modify code owners or reviewers, and we'll temporarily keep maintainers.txt active as well, it'll verify that the code owners and reviewers files are of good syntax, and that there are code owners for all files in the repo, and that the current mapping for code owners and reviewers exactly matches the mapping for maintainers. And what we can do temporarily as we get used to this new style is that we can say, if you want to update the reviewers and maintainers in the repository, update both maintainers.txt and the code owners and reviewers file together, and this checker will verify that they provide the same mapping. The syntax is not obvious, as I mentioned in a previous meeting, that setting up the rules in code owners style has some oddities around having to combine some of the rules we had in maintainers.txt that were not obvious at first. And so I think having that cross check that if you update maintainers and you understand that syntax from past work, and then this tool will help you make sure that your update to code owners matches your update to maintainers until we get that kind of process ironed out amongst the developers that may be responsible for updating the maintainers and reviewers files and code owners files.
Okay. So someone submits new code, I guess it would fall under the pack, like it wouldn't be non-owned code. I've seen a lot of projects where when you submit new code, their bot detects that you should be, they request that you become the code owner.
Right now, yeah, that is a good point. I haven't thought about having a check for that scenario yet. In a normal pull request for just any files being added, removed, or modified, making sure that new files have a code owner and having a check fail if there are no code owners for the newly added content. So that would be a pretty easy one to add as well as a simple GitHub action. I think the pull request as submitted should include the new content, and if code owners updates are required, it should that same pull request should include those updates.
Yep. All right, anything else on that topic?
Just that I'm driving as fast as possible to the state where I want to turn it on for some evaluation of the experience and then refinement of the actual process that will follow along with the proposal to drop the reviewed by, act by, and tested by tags from our commit messages.
Okay.
I joined a little late. Did you talked about GitHub issues already?
No, I was going to bring that up. So
okay.
I guess one question for this group. So, I think and I don't want it to get in the way or derail the code review process, but two things. One is for stuff that we're talking about in this meeting and trying to get some traction on getting those things done and tracking that status more transparently. I wondered about enabling issues and using GitHub's issues for tracking on that. And maybe there'd be a label for tools and CI or whatever we want to call it. And then the second part of that is as we talk about the transition to code review, would that be I think that would be an ideal time to talk about transitioning over to issues, because I think it plays into kind of that seamless process of contributing and the significantly enhanced transparency of what's going on. When they're all in GitHub, it's significantly improved.
Right, and I think that's a great idea to explore. I know that we've already kicked off. Our use of Bugzilla has one dependency on the ability to manage the security issues for Tiano Core, and I know Mickey's not here today, but I believe that she's evaluating migrating away from Bugzilla to the GitHub security issues. If that evaluation is positive and we can move all of our security issues over into the GitHub area, then I think evaluating moving the rest of our feature requests and bugs, from Bugzilla to GitHub issues is worth evaluating. We'd have to figure out what the mapping is and the number of different labels we would need. That would require some significant effort to figure out the mapping and a tool to help import the content from Bugzilla into issues.
Yeah, no, I agree. I wonder, well, one, there may already be a tool to do that. Two, we have written I've written some scripts that will query Bugzilla and do some operations. It was very easy to do in Python. So I could imagine pretty easy script there. if we had to build it ourselves. And 3, given the challenge of getting traction on many of those Bugzillas, in some ways it might be nice to maybe not copy them all over, or maybe, make that a selective process where someone has to put in some effort to make it happen.
Yeah, my concern, Sean, is the lack of movement on the Bugzillas is not a reflection of how serious or important the issue is. It's a lack of focus and resources.
Yeah.
So I would not necessarily be in favor of not importing things that are deemed real issues. And we've been at a not at a high rate of pace, but at a reasonable rate of pace. The bug scrub meeting has been attempting to determine how many things have aged out or no longer apply, or we're in a bad state. And so we've done a good job of getting through those, but not completely done. And we're still at like 600 to 700 issues sitting there. So that they may not be high priority, some of them, and I think we need to make sure that the high priority ones get attention. But that I would not, at a first glance, I would not be in favor of just not importing any and just only importing the ones that people think are important on their own. I'm concerned that we would lose a lot of information that way.
Okay. Do you think it would be acceptable to turn on the issues and figure out a way to use it for this meeting and any community meeting that has maybe not code directly like firmware code topics, but are wanting to track work? One, as a way to get people familiar with the issues and kind of ease them in, but also a way to help get some of that work done.
Tell me how this works. The only time I've seen the way issues works in GitHub is if it's associated with the repository and is closed with a pull request.
So that is the traditional way, and yes, it still would be associated with the repository, but it doesn't have to close with a PR. You can close them with whatever process you want to put in place.
So would that require creating a repository for a meeting if you're trying to track tasks associated with a meeting?
I wouldn't want to do that, but yeah, I think there's some question whether you'd want these issues added to the EDK2 issue list, or if there's a bigger umbrella under Tiano Core that we'd want to collect community-wide issues in, or if there's a different solution. Yeah. Anybody have opinions or thoughts?
I think it's wider than just the EDK2 repo. If this is tools and CI related, the closest you've got is maybe one of the tools repositories, but that makes it a little confusing too for some of the scopes of some of the tasks we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think the tools repositories right now run generally with code issues associated with those projects, and I don't think we've even talked about PyTools more than a few moments in these meetings. So I agree that doesn't make a ton of sense.
Is it possible to just use the discussions area, or is it because you can't do any searches for like discussions that are still open or closed, or that state information is not present?
I think the discussions doesn't quite have enough context associated with it. It is more free form.
What's the problem with issues? Is that it's associated with a repo? Is that the fundamental problem versus a generic bucket you can just throw stuff into?
I think that's a fair critique of I mean, I think this gets to some of the questions what we've talked about in the past around GitHub adoption, which is, do we need to have a minor like review of all of the teams that we might want to have? Do we need to have a few other repositories that are used for things like this? You know, I talked about the RFC repository that like Rustlang uses, which is, in my opinion, a really great way to do RFCs. But those are all kind of like community assets rather than just pure code. I think, you know, as we evaluate GitHub for things, we should look at what other communities have done and what they've done well, and see if there's some patterns we can borrow from.
So, yeah, I think, in my opinion, GitHub issues are the most natural and the most well understood way for developers nowadays that are coming to the project to understand what issues are in the project and how to get started. It's used on pretty much every major open source project out there. And so as they're going around from repo to repo, there's a pretty like consistent and familiar process that people go through to find issues associated with most projects through GitHub issues. It allows you to link issues and PRs. It allows you to tag issues. Communities have done things like they tag issues as friendly for beginners, right? So if we have a bunch of kind of tasks that are not particularly difficult but aren't getting prioritized, you can tag them for certain people. And then as those people are training or coming up in the community, they're able to easily find those. And it's very obvious and flows pretty naturally with other projects. So I think for like tracking issues with actual code, it to me makes sense to track them alongside the code. If we need to track issues outside code, I don't really, I guess, see why that has to be the same process. Like, can't like we could always file those in some other way than the code. It seems to me. The other nice thing you can do with issues is you can reference them in code. So if we put our stuff in GitHub issues, we could reference the issue inside the source code, and it takes you directly to the issue and tells you the status of the issue and all that kind of stuff. So it kind of like just helps complete our GitHub experience versus being torn across tools.
So Mike, how about next week we try to come back with a proposal there? I think since you're working on the code review stuff, either Michael or I can go try to pull together a little bit of a proposal, you know, not much, but something, and then we can see what you think.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem like quite a good fit to try to manage things that aren't code related using a tool that's mostly around managing code. So that's the part that I'm struggling with.
Yeah.
Why are we saying it has to be code related? I guess I don't know a lot about GitHub issues and the way it attaches itself, but can't someone just file an issue for anything?
It has to be it has to be within the scope of a repository. You can only enable issues on a repository. You can't enable issues on an organization.
Okay. What do we expect people to file issues about that are not in the EDK2 repo?
Like Sean was proposing, hey, we've got a set of like work items like in these meetings. And the work items, the result is not code. The result may be, you know, getting an assignment for who owns GCC, you know, maintenance, or, you know, go evaluate something, right? It's the result is not code that gets checked in anywhere.
I guess I don't see the problem with that being tracked separately from the code since it's not the code though.
Right.
So where would you put it?
Yeah.
Like, Michael, would you put it in the EDK2 issues and you'd put a special label on it so people understood that, or we could query it easily and find things that aren't code, or would you go to a different repo under Tiano Core and put it there? I mean, I think it's whatever we want. You can make any of these work.
Yeah, you can make any of them work. It's I mean, where are we putting it today, right? Like a lot of these things aren't getting filed in Bugzilla. Like I don't know if this meeting has written any Bugzillas yet.
No, but I guess as someone trying to keep track of some of the work items here, and I did a better job earlier, but I think, you know, I'd like to have some place that's more visible, right? There's a number of things that have made some progress, but have then stalled, which is much like a lot of activity on the mailing list because I think there's a lack of visibility. And so I'd like to see if we could use this meeting and the work items that come out of here to get people familiar with GitHub issues.
Okay. Yeah, I think we could. It doesn't seem like a difficult problem for me for us to solve. We just have to make a choice. I don't know if I'd really want them mixed with the code in the same database, though. That seems confusing. Like, I think I'd prefer the issues relating to the code to be in a separate database than random meeting ARs and to-dos and stuff like that. So I don't necessarily like even know if I'd find it desirable for them to be together. But I also don't think it would be a big deal if we just continued to track those items in Bugzilla or did whatever we wanted and track code issues in GitHub.
Okay. I think the code issues one, I think as Mike pointed out, is pending the security process change. And it seems like we have pretty good progress on that. I don't know, Mickey's not here but today, but we should check in with her on that as to see. I was going to bring up another reason to do this for the security stuff is I'd like to talk about enabling CodeQL, and CodeQL leverages that security process run by GitHub, and it automatically, in pull requests that are submitted, it automatically will create the security issues that you can then go either turn into a advisory or ignore or block the PR until they fix their issue. I think that's another reason why we would want to start looking to using GitHub issues.
Yeah. The primary benefit to me is that we can link PRs to issues directly. Very few people actually like link their Git information to their Bugzillas today.
Okay, let's take that as an action item to go off and propose a little bit of a plan. I mean, I think the other benefit we talked about at one point a few weeks ago was like release notes can be auto-generated because you have tightly coupled between your PRs, your issues, and your different Git tags. And there's all sorts of, you know, you can start using milestones and the other tagging information within GitHub to make all that information really easy to find.
Right, I mean, there are a lot of manual effort things going on today, like Lemmy managing the releases and the planning for the releases. You know, that becomes a project, and you can then identify the set of issues that are gonna be targeted for the next one and set your milestones for it. Yeah, I agree, there's a lot of advantages for using the infrastructure that's there in GitHub for managing the project, even when the content is spread across multiple repositories. It seems like all the features are there to manage that.
Yep. Okay, we can come back next week and hopefully have some sort of proposal. So real quick on that CodeQL. So Mike, we're getting pushed pretty hard because of the whole executive order thing that we have to show, you know, that we're doing static analysis and that any issues that are coming up, we have a plan to resolve. for the projects that I work on, we're using CodeQL. And because we are using EDK2, I think there's a few hundred issues that are coming up in that scan.
Sure.
So it'd be ideal for us to fix those in the upstream, right, in EDK2.
Yep.
I guess I'm looking for people who have opposition to that, and I'm wondering if we could start prototyping out a Azure pipeline that will run, or your GitHub action that will run CodeQL. Kind of start weighing the cost in that of running that, and when we can run it, how often, and working on that process a little bit.
Right, and so I encourage you to pull Felix from AMI into this conversation. He's the one that put the RFC out to add static analysis to the EDK2, and I've seen 2 proposals so far. One is Open Coverity, the other is the Clang Analyze. So this would be a third one, and really need to kind of ground out on which one. It doesn't make sense in general, in my past experience, to run more than one static analysis tool. It just gets complicated when you do that. So picking one and sticking with it. And if others report issues from other static analysis tools, those can just be entered as separate bugs that are not necessarily automated for something that was found for a real issue that was found by a different static analysis tool independent of the one that we've chosen for TianoCore. So I don't know where CodeQL stands relative to those other 2 as far as the coverage it gets or the frequency of false positives and things like that.
Michael, do you have anything you want to add to the CodeQL stuff since you were looking at it a little bit?
What was the question about false positives and coverage?
Yes.
It's I would say like its coverage is okay. It generally falls into the same problem that I imagine every static analysis tool finds on the code, which is people doing things like asserting if a pointer is null, but then not returning from a function. So you get these large classes of problems that are relatively trivial to fix. I imagine other people are running tools, whether it's CodeQL or other tools, that flag the same problems. They're just not at a severity level where they're fixing them. And that is what most of the issues are. So I would say like it's not, in my opinion, finding a large number of types of issues that I'm sure people don't know about in the code. It's kind of like a bunch of this just busy work and tedious work of cleaning things up, which in some cases, I have looked at a few of these. I haven't looked at them in detail, but in some cases, although what it's finding does kind of raise larger questions about the surrounding code. So sometimes you might see, oh, this pointer is not being checked, and then you might go back and trace where that pointer is coming from, and it kind of leads into a larger set of things that you may fix in the code. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's I guess it's moderately helpful, slightly high effort in terms of the hundreds of issues, and the code base would probably be better for it. But again, I don't think anything that I saw was the types of like super like undiscovered problems that we wouldn't have known about otherwise. So that's just kind of my take on what I've seen so far.
Yeah, and I think a couple challenges that we identified in previous discussions with Felix is the first time you run the new static analysis tool, if it comes up with a large number of issues, are any of those at the severity that we would want to have reviewed by the InfoSec team for TianoCore before trying to do a fix? Versus things that are just not necessarily high severity, but are just obvious, issues that can be quickly fixed. or at least the work item entered it for somebody to go fix it. So that kind of triage task is the heavyweight piece to get any of these started and to categorize those issues that need some extra attention. If we end up with 0 in that category, that's great. We can just move right ahead.
Okay, and that to be clear was you said you need to determine if the issue basically needs to go on the InfoSec list or not, right?
Or needs to be needs an assessment by InfoSec, right?
Okay.
So usually we don't leave it up to a single individual to determine the severity, right? We go, if we think that this is something that needs attention, send it to InfoSec and they can do the real grading and determine whether or not it can just go back to the public side for resolution, or if it does need some special attention.
Okay. Yeah, I agree that some of the stuff would need, I think, that kind of review done. It's not so trivial that I think we could just not triage some of them.
Okay, so that's the getting started problem for static analysis. And then once we get past the getting started problem, we have to figure out what our, day-to-day, week-to-week workflow is. If we can afford to run CodeQL on every PR, that's ideal. Because then we can basically prevent things from getting in, as a commit with an open issue. If it's too expensive to run on every PR, then there's a lag time between the commit and detection, and we need a commitment from the community to resolve issues that are identified post-commit. So I guess we need that information, Sean, as to whether or not we can afford to run it on every PR.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that because of the way it works, where it basically injects itself into the compiler. I wonder if actually it really costs us anything additional, because I think it actually still compiles the code, doesn't it, Michael? You're on mute. Okay, so I'll look into whether it actually compiles the code, because if it did, then we'd still get our compile test just like we get today with CI, and that's really what we pay the cost for, right? The time cost. And we would get the code coverage. And if it, let's say it added 30 seconds, like we could probably handle that without any problem.
Yeah, my experience, OpenCoverity works the same way. It injects itself into the build process, but it does not generate an executable. It kind of, takes over.
Okay. Okay, I'll look into that, because again, if it did, that'd be great. And it also, for our CI test, we don't actually go all the way down to the executable, right? We just compile. We don't, I guess we link some things, but we don't link everything. Like if we have libraries, we don't link them all. So,
right, it could definitely be a parallel job, just like we can do like host-based unit tests and CodeQL. That's 2 separate parallel jobs. The actual build test of the real firmware, or the package, that's another parallel job. So there's definitely opportunities for parallelism here. I just don't know how execution time wise, whether or not running CodeQL is significantly longer, even in a parallel job relative to the other things we could run in parallel.
okay.
But I'm in favor of getting this evaluated, and as I said, I'd pull Felix in just because he's been doing a lot more thinking on this as well, and can maybe help do a pros cons assessment to help, provide a recommendation to the community, amongst the 3 that have been identified.
Sorry, I had to step away for a few minutes in case anything came back my way. I had a contractor here doing some work and I had to go talk to them.
The only question I didn't have an answer to was, when we build for CodeQL, do you know if the build process still actually creates a compiled output that is, that is actually executable.
That's the way we're doing it.
Right, it still makes the build, right? So if we
Yeah.
actually could combine the CodeQL analysis along with the CI build test step, compile step, right?
Yep, that's what we've done today.
So it wouldn't really cost us much extra. I mean, I assume CodeQL takes a few more seconds somewhere, but
I think it actually takes like 30 minutes.
oh,
but
okay.
but you can set it up to only run once every 24 hours.
Yeah,
Or
that
so
comes with
right.
its own negative side effects of now having to have a process for bugs and fixing those bugs rather
Yeah.
than being able to catch them with the PR.
Yeah. It just depends, yeah. If you want to leave open the option to defer things maybe to like a weekly rolling basis that you go back and fix them. But ideally, yeah, I think it makes sense to do it at the PR level. And we have a lot of the builds like kind of parallelized at the moment between the packages and stuff. So maybe we just throw one more pipeline on for this and just let it go alongside the other ones. And our things take so long to get in anyways. I don't think anyone's going to care about 30 minutes. They're usually waiting days.
Okay. Well, I think we'll take point in prototyping that as well. And I guess it sounds like we need to talk with Felix.
Right, and I have a GitHub action that was doing the Coverity stuff on demand, as a on demand GitHub action workflow, and it could have been set up as a cron job with just one extra line of code in the GitHub action.
Yep.
But the Open Coverity, because of their use restrictions based upon size of the code base being analyzed, I think would limit TianoCore to 4 scans a week. So that's why it could not be scaled to the PR scope. It would have to be, go run once or twice a week at most. My other question about CodeQL is, how do you manage the issues discovered by CodeQL? What happens to them?
So they go into that security tab in GitHub, and then you can ignore them. I mean, you can see them based on the PRs and where they were introduced on new code, and you can ignore them if they're false positives, or you can, block the PR until they're fixed.
Okay. And who has access to that security tab? Is it everybody or only a select set?
So the security tab, I think, is only if you're within the project. I wouldn't be so. I would expect that if you were the pull request author, you would get to see the security issues that you introduced. But that would be something we'd have to evaluate.
Okay.
But it shows up as another GitHub action, and then it has a link that you click, and it takes you to your view.
Okay. Well, I'm happy to hear that it has some ways to manage the issues, identify. If you say it's not an issue, then it gets just set aside. Does it actually, if you say it is a real issue, does it get then converted to a GitHub issue?
So I'll get back to you next week on that.
Sure.
It can definitely get converted into an advisory. So if it's scanning and it's like a big deal and you want to make a CVE out of it, there's a process to convert into an advisory. I'm not 100% sure if you can convert them into normal issues, or if that would be the desired workflow. Because what we've seen is that when you introduce it, your PR where you introduce that workflow obviously comes in with a whole bunch of issues. But the idea would be that you would either fix them all in your PR or ignore them, and then you wouldn't have any issues left before your PR was completed, or as your PR is completed. So
Sure.
I think that that workflow is ideal for tying it to the PR. But I think it is something we need to look into a little bit more. Yeah.
Okay. And one other thing I discovered in setting up the scanning using OpenCoverity is that, you know, it was doing it at the, you know, doing the package builds, but would need to build for all the supported CPU architectures for each of those packages. And the reason is if you look at some of our INF files, some of them have different source code that's pulled in based upon CPU architecture. So, you know, you've got to make sure that the code QL, the way we would build, would get us the coverage for all the CPU architectures if there are differences in the source code that would be scanned based upon CPU architecture.
Yep.
And I know from a performance of running the scan and then doing the analysis, you know, I don't know if there's an optimization possible. For example, if there's one module that is generic for all CPU architectures versus one that has maybe just one special code path between IE32 and x64, and another one that has only a special code path for maybe ARC64, if there's a way to optimize the build and the scan to not necessarily have to rebuild for all architectures the generic code.
Okay. We'll see what we can find.
But I agree with how important it is for TanoCore to have a static analysis facility enabled. I think it's very important, and we've got to get enough resources in place to actually fix the issues that are flagged.
Okay, any other topics for anyone?
I found that there were some packages missing CI YAML files. I sent a message about that. Did we want those packages to get CI YAML files, or I guess Art was a little confused by what I meant by intentional. But I meant like, are the maintainers of those packages aware that they're missing CI YAML files and that was a conscious decision? Or did some packages just get missed whenever these CI YAML files were being added?
Well, it's even far worse than what you identified, Michael. That even the packages that have CI YAML files have a lot of the checks disabled, or
Yeah, I'm
they
aware.
they have lots of exceptions. So I think there is a gap there that we probably need all of the package maintainers to have a focused effort on turning on as many CI checks as possible and eliminating the exceptions that could be fixed by actually fixing code.
Okay, because I made an update to Uncrustify that I want to pull in here soon. But in the process of doing that, I was running Uncrustify against the EDK2 code base again, and realized that there were formatting changes popping up in some of these packages that weren't related to the Uncrustify change. And it's because people have added code to these packages that don't have CI YAML files, and their code is, you know, out of compliance with Uncrustify.
Okay, so even though Uncrustify is on by default, if the YAML file is missing, it doesn't run.
Right.
Okay, yeah, that's a problem. I agree. So even an empty YAML file would be helpful.
Yeah, Sean, does it have to say Uncrustify check in it, or can it
I
just
think
be
you
empty?
have to enable the uncrustified check.
But just putting that in there would at least get Uncrustified to run.
Yes. Yeah, and there's no problem with a YAML file with just that one check enabled and nothing else.
Right.
So I would encourage you to, as far as trying to help improve the Uncrustify quality, to just go ahead and submit the code change to add the YAML files that turn on Uncrustify.
Okay, so I'll add those to the packages, at least the ones that have already been formatted, which I think should be all of them at this point, because they weren't too far off, but it was obvious that they're kind of drifting in the wrong direction without us having that YAML file there. So I'll add the CI YAML file and then do the Uncrustify update that they need to get them back working with it again. And then as far as picking up a new Uncrustify tool update, would we want to do that? I thought we mentioned before we wanted to do that around stable tags or something versus in the middle of stable tags.
Is it actually going to change the format of the code previously formatted?
Only like 3 places. It's a very specific targeted change, and that's how most of these will be. None of them are going to like vastly reformat the code base. That's not the intention, but there's just one case where if you have like parentheses inside a struct assignment and it happens to be in such a specific way that it causes the parentheses to potentially not be aligned quite right. And so this just fixes that. But like I've said, I've run it against the code base and I've seen that it targets only like the 4 spots that it needs to. So I think it's pretty low risk.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. For one that's at that scope, I think you could do it at any time. If it's a larger scoped change as far as number of files, then I may suggest that we do it just immediately after a stable tag as a good sync point. But if you think that's the category now and is likely going to be the category in the future as we make probably tiny refinements, it could go in almost any time.
Okay. The other thing, there were some like kind of loose ends that we had from the Uncrustify discussions I was recalling as I went back to it. Like we were talking about making some style guide some like style spec updates and some other things. Did we want to resume that at some point, or like I don't know. I don't know if
we want the coding style guide and Uncrustify to match.
Okay. And I think we wanted to make some changes to the guide as well. Like, I don't know if you recall, but there was like the debug code macro. And I think that we decided that we didn't want it to have the begin and end. We wanted people to call it through just the macro itself or something. There were some decisions like that we made at the time that I don't think were captured, but I remember we converted some code to work that way, and we probably need to update some documents with those decisions. The other one was the optional modifier at the end of a parameter. I think we decided we wanted that to be inside the comma, right, versus outside the comma, because we saw that there's code that does it both ways, and technically it works both ways. But I think in general, if it's inside the comma, it's much easier to format. And
I think Uncrustify did the wrong thing if it was outside the comma and there were additional parameters past the optional one.
Right. Yeah, there was just things like that started coming back to that I started recalling. So, yeah, okay. So we should probably at some point update the document. I'll add that to my list, but we might need, if someone else is available to help with that, I could work with them at least.
And there is a Bugzilla category for the EDK2C coding style guide, and there's a number of issues to be fixed that are open right now. So you can add to that list to so that those requests for the spec changes are in one place.
Okay.
All right, anyone have anything else? All right, if no one else has things, then we'll talk next week. Thanks.